Hi students, we're back. In this lecture I'm going to talk a little bit more about Russ Shafer-Landau's intro to chapter 18 of your book. In particular, we're going to look at the argument analysis section, where he discusses some of the arguments for and against affirmative action and an argument for reparations. The first argument he discusses is the racism argument. According to that argument, premise 1 of it says racism is immoral. That sounds right. Premise 2 of the argument is that affirmative action is a form of racism. And if we have those two premises, we can conclude that affirmative action is immoral. So if racism is immoral and affirmative action is a form of racism, then affirmative action must be immoral as well. Now, Shafer-Landau rejects this argument, and I think rightfully so. You can't reject it because it's invalid. The structure is perfect. There's nothing to criticize there. The question, though, is, are these premises true? Premise 1 is true, right? Racism is immoral. The view that certain races are inferior to others, that's not correct. But premise 2 is false, according to Shafer-Landau. Affirmative action is not a form of racism. So why is that? You'll remember we defined what it means for an act to be racist last time. And what we said was this: an act is racist only if it expresses the view that members of a given community are inferior by virtue of their racial identity. But when we engage in affirmative action, we're not saying that members of a certain group are inferior by virtue of their racial identity. So since affirmative action doesn't do this, right, it doesn't suggest or express the view that a certain race is inferior, we don't select black candidates in affirmative action cases preferential treatment. We don't give black candidates preferential treatment because we think they're superior to white people. Rather, we do it because we think there's been this historical injustice. And so affirmative action isn't racist in the same way that something like slavery was. We've got a quote here from Shafer-Landau that just explains basically that same idea. So affirmative action policies aren't motivated by and don't convey the view that whites are inferior to minorities. Affirmative action policies don't stigmatize whites, they don't express any form of hatred or condemnation towards white people, and they don't claim any kind of moral, emotional, or spiritual superiority for minorities. He goes on, affirmative action doesn't contribute to the reinforcement of oppression. Racism is a form of oppression, a system of social forces that systemically limit opportunities and impose other harms on members of a given population. Of course, many white people suffer great disadvantages, right? But the color of their skin isn't the disadvantage, right? In almost all contexts, the color of their skin affords white people privileges rather than disadvantages. And so that's why affirmative action isn't racist, because it's not some systemic way of harming white people. Rather, it's a policy that's instituted to promote equal opportunity for minorities. Let's turn now to the qualifications argument. So this is going to be another argument against affirmative action. Here's premise 1 of that argument. Fairness requires that positions should be awarded solely on the basis of merit, that is, of who is best qualified for the position. Premise 2 says affirmative action does not do this, right? It doesn't award positions solely on the basis of an applicant's qualifications. Instead, it awards them on the basis of their racial or ethnic identity. And so the conclusion is that affirmative action is unfair or unjust. Shafer-Landau thinks that there's a problem with this argument too. What premise is it? Which premise should we reject? Should we reject premise 1, the claim that fairness requires that positions be awarded on the basis of merit? Or should we reject premise 2, the claim that affirmative action does not award positions solely on the basis of qualifications? I think premise 2 is right? Affirmative action isn't awarding positions solely on the basis of someone's qualifications. So the problem must be premise 1. What's wrong with premise 1? Right? That's the question. So why should we reject it? Premise 1 is saying essentially that whenever we're hiring someone, whenever we're selecting someone for college admissions, we should always be selecting the person who merits that, the person who's most qualified for that position. But there are a lot of cases where we select people not on the basis of merit. So, for example, Shafer-Landau gives an example where you're hiring a contractor to maybe do some renovations on your house. And they submit bids, and you look and you find the best bid, and you're about to hire that contractor. When you find out that one of the other contractors, right, whose bid was maybe just a little worse than the best one, really needs this job, or else they're gonna go out of business. They're gonna maybe they're in dire financial straits, and they need this business to help them. Shafer-Landau says it'd be perfectly fine for you to hire this the second best contractor, right? Maybe if you want to think about their qualifications, maybe they're like less experienced than the one that submitted what you took to be the best bid. But it's fine to do that. There's nothing wrong with selecting someone for a job that's slightly less qualified than someone else. If that example isn't convincing, he gives another. So when we think of military veterans applying for admissions into college or applying for certain public service jobs, the law of the land is that those people get some sort of preferential treatment. Why? The thought is, well, they've sacrificed a great deal for our country. They deserve a leg up. And so, again, here's a case where we're not awarding positions based on merit, based on qualifications. We're awarding positions, whether that's in colleges or for jobs, on the basis of something else. And finally, and I think this is in some ways the strongest argument, that fairness doesn't require that positions be awarded based on merit, is that we don't, generally speaking, follow that rule. So when we're admitting people to college, we've got this guy over here who didn't get in, and he's blaming it on the minority and says, it's his fault that I didn't get in. But he's ignoring the fact that we give preferential treatment to the children of alumni. We give preferential treatment admissions to the children of donors. We give preferential treatment to athletes. Shafer-Landau talks about musicians, right? We might give preferential treatment to people who are, raised in a different state because they pay out-of-state tuition or something, and that makes us more money, right? So there are all sorts of cases where we're not looking just at qualifications, we're not looking just at merit, we're looking at other things too, to serve important goals of the university. And so it's okay not to select people based on their qualifications or merit in every case. What these examples show, Shafer-Landau says, is that it's permissible to violate the principle of merit in a range of cases, including those where valuable goals, such as building alumni support or honoring veterans, are achieved by doing so. Affirmative action, too, is designed to achieve this laudable goal, the reduction of oppression and the increase of equal opportunity for those who are members of historically disadvantaged groups. So even if affirmative action is unfair, that unfairness might be outweighed by the good that it can do. All right. On to the last argument about affirmative action. This is called the equal opportunity argument. The first premise says, a society is morally required to provide its citizens with equal opportunity to gain valuable resources and positions. That if a policy helps society meet this goal, then the policy is legitimate. Affirmative action helps society meet this goal of equal opportunity. Therefore, affirmative action is morally legitimate. Now, I think whereas the previous arguments failed, now maybe there's some way to resuscitate those previous arguments. Maybe that we can salvage them somehow. This argument is not as obviously flawed, but we can identify a most controversial premise. So let's look through and see which of these premises seems the most controversial. Premise 1, societies should provide citizens with equal opportunity to gain valuable resources and positions. That seems right. That's what society should do, give people equal opportunities. So if policies help society meet this goal, then it seems like those policies are legitimate. Premise 3 says affirmative action helps achieve the goal of equal opportunity. Now this is the premise that's going to be controversial, according to Shafer-Landau, because some people think, and as he describes in his chapter, right, some people think, right, we already live in a society of equal opportunity. And I think in many ways that's true. We do live in a society of equal opportunity. The problem, though, is that what we live in is a society where there's de jure equal opportunity, but there's an important distinction between de jure equality or equal opportunity and de facto equality or equal opportunity. So de jure equality is equality in the content of the law. The law doesn't discriminate and give additional benefits or opportunities to one racial group over another. But as a matter of fact, we might notice that certain racial groups do have more opportunities than others. We can just think back to the statistics, right? Insofar as the median white family has 12 times the wealth of the median black family, we might think that creates unequal opportunities. The example that Shafer-Landau gives is that you and I have the equal opportunity with Bill Gates to buy this yacht here. But while we have de jure equality, like if we had the money, we could pay for it, we don't have de facto equality. As a matter of fact, Bill Gates can buy that yacht, and I can't. Why? Because Bill Gates has billions of dollars, and I do not. So, although there's a sense in which we're equal, that if we had the money, we could buy it, there's another sense in which we're not equal, in that we don't both have an opportunity to buy it. Now, this might not be that big of a deal when it comes to buying yachts, but when it comes to getting a position in a profession, for example, as a lawyer or doctor, a teacher, a construction management worker, the thought is that our opportunities, while they're equal de jure, we have de jure equality, right? Anyone can join these professions. There's not de facto equality. It's not true that the average minority would have the same opportunity as the average white person to become a lawyer or a doctor or whatnot. And the wealth inequality is part explanation of that, but implicit bias and other things also play a role. So that's, if we want to give the best argument for affirmative action, it's going to be something like that really there isn't this de facto equality, and having affirmative action sort of helps us get to a place where in society we do have a de facto equality. All right, the final thing I want to look at is the reparations argument, and this is an argument for paying reparations to Native Americans and African Americans. The argument goes like this. Premise 1. If one party has imposed systemic harms on the members of a targeted group, then the wrongdoer is morally required to provide reparations to the victims. Premise 2. The U.S. government has imposed systemic harms on members of at least two groups, Native Americans and African Americans. Conclusion. Therefore, the U.S. government owes reparations to Native Americans and African Americans. Now, this argument, again, is valid. We want to look, are the premises true? If one group has imposed systemic harms on members of a target group, then the wrongdoer is required to provide reparations. Yep, that seems right. So if I harm you by stealing your phone, then I owe you something in return. The US government has imposed systemic harms on at least two groups, Native Americans and African Americans. Also, that seems right. So the conclusion is that the US government owes reparations to Native Americans and African Americans. So what's controversial about this? I think it can't be premise 2, right? Maybe it's hard to say that it's premise 1, but I think if there's a kind of controversial premise, maybe it's premise 1. Maybe it's something farther down the line, right? So if we're thinking of reparations as cash payments, then maybe it's false that if one party has imposed systemic harms on members of a target group, then the wrongdoer is merely required to provide cash payments to the victim. Maybe they're required to do something else. And I think one reason that we're going to be skeptical of premise 1 potentially is that while the US government has imposed these harms, the government itself can't pay back those harms. In order for the government to pay someone something, it's got to have money. Where does it get the money? Well, it gets it from particular individuals. And so there's this question about, is it just for the US government to take money from people who are currently wealthy and use that money to pay back the victims of systemic harm, like Native Americans and African Americans? That's a question we're going to look at a little bit more when we talk about the Houseman paper. So that's it for now. We'll stop there and we'll see you again soon.